In this series, lowimpact.org talks with people working to build a mutually owned, democratic, decentralised economy that builds community and doesn't destroy nature. We want to increase collaboration to bring about system change. Find links to the sites mentioned in the videos in the description below. Join the conversation by liking, commenting and subscribing to our channel.
Okay. So today I'm talking with Tom Woodroof of Local Loop Merseyside and Mutual Credit Services about the Credit Commons, a way to federate different groups all over the world that are building the commons economy, because you can't get everything you need from just your community. But it does it without centralised control. And I want to get more details from Tom. Hello, Tom.
Hi, Dave.
Now, I'm talking to you from Stroud, where a group of us are trying to build the commons economy. And I know you're doing something very interesting and related in Liverpool, which we can touch on today, but maybe we can talk about that in more detail another time. In Stroud, we have the beginnings of a housing commons and a climbing commons, and there have been conversations about a water commons, land commons, food commons, energy commons. We've got some top specialists ready to go. Now, we can't really have a thriving commons economy using bank-issued, debt-based money. We need a credit commons to be at the core of it, don't we?
Yep. Well, this is exactly it. As you say, in Stroud, there's all this amazing work around the housing commons, the climbing commons. I've heard there's land and food commons in the works. And I think, as Dale Green is fond of saying, the really powerful thing about that is the material interdependence, actually bringing people together with infrastructure and improving their lives. But exactly as you said, if you're doing that using the existing financial system, and of course we live in an increasingly financialized economy where everything is being hollowed out by financial capitalism, if we're using the tools of financial capitalism to try and build the commons, it's ultimately going to be self-limiting, if not outright self-defeating. And so exactly as you say, we actually need a whole set of new financial tools in order to build the commons economy most effectively. Because, of course, the financial system is all about coordination of material interdependence at scale.
Yeah. So it's no good if the credit commons is only understood in the academic or uber techie world. It has to be understood in communities so that it can be implemented in communities. It needs to be widely adopted, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. There really has to be a meaningful process of co-design. It's one thing to have technical and subject matter experts who can talk about this stuff all day, or can build all sorts of fancy tech, but if actually that is unaddressable or unrecognizable or just irrelevant to actual communities who are doing commoning, you're not really going to get very far. And so that's actually a huge amount of what MCS does, is we really try and synthesize the best thinking we can find from tech, of course, from economics, from governance, from political economy, from all these different domains, and we try and then bring that expertise to ordinary communities and work with them using their local expertise to co-design something which is actually going to speak to their needs, work for them, and will present itself as an adjacent possible, so that they can look at it and go, yeah, I could see myself using that. I can see how that would make my life better. I can see how that could rebuild community.
Yeah. Right, let's get into some questions. And I'll link to more information in the description below. And for some questions, you can just point me at online sources of information. So first of all, what is it? What is the Credit Commons? Can we explain the Credit Commons in terms the layperson can understand?
Right, yeah. So there's an important distinction to be drawn here between, the Credit Commons is this kind of vision of an entirely new economic system, which is based on commons, and of course we'll have to have a financial system supporting it, and the Credit Commons Protocol, which is one of the tools which will be part of this new commons financial system. So that's a really important distinction to draw. Of course, when we started out with MCS, we started out with the Credit Commons Protocol because we knew Matthew Slater, and it had this wonderful idea about attempting to overcome the limitations of previous mutual credit systems around scalability and centralisation. And so we started out thinking, right, this is our tool. This is how we're going to change the world. This idea of federated mutual credit ledgers implemented via this thing called the Credit Commons Protocol. What we've realized over the last few years, though, is that, of course, there are going to have to be many other tools. You can't hope to change the world economy as massively diverse and dynamic as it is with just one tool. And so there is this tool called the Credit Commons Protocol, but as I see it, it's not only desirable, but it's entirely necessary. But we have a whole variety of other tools, which may or may not be called credit commons this or credit commons that, but are nonetheless, part of the financial infrastructure for supporting the new commons economy. And I know that on Low Impact, you've written about some of these things like credit clearing, things like use credit obligations. There's a whole suite of these tools which I see as being essential for building the commons underpinning the commons economy.
Yeah. So could you talk to people in Stroud who want to try and get a grip on what the credit commons is? Could you see the credit commons as just another sector of the economy, like the finance sector? We're building a housing commons, land commons, energy commons. Is the credit commons just commoning the finance sector?
I don't really think that that's the best way to look at it, because it's kind of hard to think of a sector of the economy which isn't in some way reliant on finance. And so you can't draw this kind of say, finance is just another sector which you can talk about in isolation, or that you can kind of silo off and say, oh, we're going to do the finance commons next. We've done housing, we've done energy, we've done food, we've done blah, blah, blah. And now we're going to do money. It cuts across. And of course, this is exactly, one of the characteristics of financial capitalism, is that increasingly more and more of the economy is monetized, more and more social relationships are mediated through money. And therefore, in a sense, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, really, because financialization is a terrible thing. Universities shouldn't be run as businesses. Care shouldn't be a for-profit enterprise. These decisions should not be made on the basis of financial return. And yet, that's where we're at. And obviously, that's something which we're very much looking to mitigate, and say, actually, yes, of course, finance has a place, but it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of everything. Nonetheless, the kind of silver lining of that condition is that if you can say and do interesting things around finance, you can end up talking to all sorts of different people across all sectors of the economy. And so exactly, I don't think it's as simple as kind of commoning finance. I think it's about and of course, another interesting thing about the financial system is, because it cuts across all sectors, you really need to be able to talk to all sorts of different sectors in the real economy. And so again, you can't kind of isolate it and say, right, it's just next in line.
So it's more like the nervous system of the entire commons economy, and has fingers in every sector.
That's a nice metaphor, yeah. Or you could think of it as a kind of substrate. And exactly as I was saying at the start, if you're trying to common these different sectors, which you can, at least to some extent, talk about in on their own terms, like housing, food, internet, energy, for example, that absolutely makes sense. But because one of the things they have in common is a need for finance, it does cut right across. It is a substrate. The nervous system is also a nice metaphor, and so it really deserves its own treatment.
Right. So I was reading recently about late 19th century, early 20th century. Communists wanted large-scale centralized industry, and anarchists wanted small-scale and decentralized industry, and the anarchists lost. And one reason that I read was that the small and decentralized businesses weren't connected. They didn't have a united front. They didn't have a united front. How will small businesses be connected in a commons economy? Via the Credit Commons Protocol? And if so, what does that mean exactly?
Potentially, you can imagine, so because the Credit Commons Protocol is a protocol for mutual credit, you can well imagine there being certain parts of the economy in which you could introduce a mutual credit, and then the businesses would be connected in that way. In our analysis, though, the kind of subset of businesses with it, particularly within Western economies where supply chains are very, very linear and there's actually not very much circularity, the number of businesses which will actually be suitable for a mutual credit is actually going to be relatively small. And so this is part of where the need for these other mechanisms comes in. And so with local Merseyside, for example, we start with credit clearing, which is a mechanism which enables us to bring very, very large numbers of businesses into, give them a kind of gateway into the kind of credit commons world in a way which is much more generally applicable, much lower risk, and much more scalable than mutual credit via the Credit Commons Protocol is. And so there are a whole variety of ways in which small businesses might be connected in this new economy. We don't necessarily start with the Credit Commons Protocol, but effectively what we see is networks of small businesses coming together, sharing information about their trading, and us applying the various Credit Commons tools we've got in order to improve their trading. And hopefully that will have maybe not very strongly at first, because credit clearing is a kind of very loose association compared to a mutual credit.
And it's
It
easier
might
to
start out-
understand. It's easier to understand.
It's
for
easier to
businesses.
understand, but the important thing is we can start to bring large numbers of businesses into these associations with each other, start them having to act not not as a collective, that's the wrong term, but start to act a bit more cohesively and with a bit more solidarity, and what's more, actually experience pretty immediate direct financial rewards for doing so, and that will then open up further opportunities for even more cohesion, even more collaboration within the subsets of a large network where a mutual credit actually makes sense, which really won't be everywhere.
Yeah, we've had this conversation before. So we've seen sort of credit clearing as a gateway drug to the credit commons, and then mutual credit can come later when there's more trust
right. Yeah, the conditions under which mutual credit really makes sense are really quite restrictive. So we've actually concluded it's almost the last thing you do. You can get an awfully long way with changing the way the economy works, just using network science techniques long before you start opening these quite difficult questions around what is the nature of money, can we design better alternatives? Simply by analysing existing trading and debt networks, we can do an awful lot. And of course, the nice thing about that is that you're not calling on people to question their deeply held beliefs about money and what the nature of money is, or ask them to accept, these strange monetary instruments. But you can nonetheless build the appetite for that and collect the information on the local economy, which enables you to do a confident co-design process and give the best possible chances that when you do introduce a mutual credit, it's actually going to have the desired outcomes rather than disappoint everyone.
Yeah. Okay. So so we've got information about credit clearing on low impact. I can link to that in the description. We've got information about mutual credit. We've got lots of information about the commons economy. I can link to all that. So let's focus on the credit commons, and we see it as the sort of the monetary system of the commons economy. And so, what's the credit commons protocol? Where does that fit in?
The credit commons protocol is a ledger for doing mutual credit.
It's a ledger.
Yep. It's a ledger for keeping track of exchanges, is what it is. And so,
like an accounting system.
It's an accounting system, exactly. It's a system of accounting for exchange. And so, for example, if I buy something off you and we both have an account in a particular credit commons ledger, then the number in my account will go down and the number in your account goes up. And so what the system has done is it's captured the fact that an exchange is taking place, the fact that that exchange has been given a price, and that the records therefore need to be updated.
Yeah, it just shows who's done what for whom.
Effectively, yeah, it's a record of exchanges in the economy, or at least it's a record of those exchanges in the economy which have been, the participants have agreed will be tracked through this ledger system.
Okay, so if you're thinking of, if you've got a business network in your town and you want to operate together using mutual credit, you want to build that sort of network on a credit commons ledger. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, the network building itself is much more of a kind of community building process.
Yes.
It's about going out and talking to people and finding out, who's up for what, who's buying what, who's selling what, who's trading with each other, and kind of attempting to find the conditions under which a mutual credit might make things better. Once you've actually got to that stage, then in technical terms, the step would be, okay, we're going to set up a ledger for this network of businesses. They're each going to get an account on this ledger. And obviously we have to build some way for them to interact with the ledger, which is user-friendly and, intuitive, and ideally speaks to their existing accounting software and generally makes it as easy as possible for them to start using.
Okay, so I want to come back to this because I want to talk about sort of definition of the credit commons and the credit commons protocol first, and then I want to talk about the benefits, and then I want to talk about actually getting things going in communities. So
right, and there's another really important thing to say about the credit commons protocol, which is, of course, that it can do recursive federation. And so this was, Matthew Slater's insight was that previous mutual credit systems had kind of faced a bit of a problem, in as much as, one of the really amazing things about mutual credit is it both depends upon and rewards trust. And of course, trust doesn't scale. And so there are almost kind of two alternatives available to previous mutual credit systems, which is either you stay small and trust-based and remain genuinely mutual, but you can't become economically significant because you can't grow large enough to support real economic diversity and dynamism. And so you stay completely marginal. or you go the way Veerbank in Switzerland went, which has been going for about 100 years now, and they got big. I think they're something like 1% of Swiss GDP or something, so not negligible.
I heard they
But
were
there's
trading. I heard they were trading something like €1 billion a year in mutual credit.
something like that. It's a significant amount, but the thing is, it's not mutual. There's almost no mutuality involved. In order to get big enough, they've had to massively centralize, and so
Okay,
actually,
so
it's now more like a private currency,
right.
run by a bank, and they call themselves Veerbank now. And so, that's the kind of choice they've had to face is, stay small and local and trust based and mutual, but have negligible impact, or have significant impact but lose the mutuality. The whole point of the Credit Commons Protocol is that you can actually achieve both scale and decentralization through a recursive federation structure.
So that's the main problem it solves. How to move towards a global sort of commons economy without losing your local autonomy and your decentralized sort of governance.
Right. And I wouldn't go so far as to say it solves it, because there is fundamentally a tension there, right? Ultimately, if you insist on being relatively small, local, and decentralized, you are going to lose some economies of scale. That's just the reality. But nonetheless, the Credit Commons Protocol attempts to strike a balance between those two competing forces, and says, actually, no, we can probably make quite a lot of headway by attempting to keep local mutual credit groups genuinely quite small, but nonetheless federate them into a larger network of networks, and then network of networks of networks, which can actually have some serious economic clout without being melted into one giant centralized network.
Yeah. Okay, so before we go talk a bit more about the benefits of this approach, I just want to come back and talk a bit more about this protocol, because for a lot of people, they won't have any idea what that means. And the way it was explained to me once is that it's a bit like the rules of chess,
right,
so that people are able to connect with each other and play chess if they understand the rules of chess. But nobody owns the rules of chess.
right.
They're just out there. They're just something that people can use to connect with each other.
Yeah.
So this protocol, what does it look like, and how can people in the commons economy engage with it, use it?
Right. Well, I mean, that almost goes without saying, but the really important thing about having a protocol is that at least we can agree the terms of engagement. If we're going to be exchanging amongst each other and agreeing that we're going to keep score, you have to agree how you're keeping score. Otherwise, you're going to get all sorts of kind of free riding and all sorts of arguments. And so, as a kind of basis for engagement, you have to say, this is how we keep track of exchange. This is the protocol we use to do it. These are the rules of chess. Because if someone shows up and they have a totally different conception of what chess is, and you try and play a chess game with them, it's not really going to work.
These are the rules. These are the rules of exchange in the Credit Commons.
Exactly. So the protocol is just intended to do that, is to make it very, very clear and unambiguous how the accounting for exchange takes place. Of course, that's not something which a typical business or even is going to actually be able to directly use. And so you need a few layers on top of that. You need some kind of application, maybe a mobile app, which can speak the language of the Credit Commons Protocol, and which can get the Credit Commons Protocol to do certain things, like update a balance in the ledger in a way which is intuitive to the user, and they don't have to worry how it works. That's exactly
the thing. That's exactly the thing. Nobody wants to know about the nuts and bolts and how it works. It has to be intuitive.
Not at all.
And if it's on an app, that's even better. Does this app exist?
Yeah, we've been building a mutual credit app for a network in Sweden, and also we've done a version of it for a group out in Vermont in the United States. And this is a pretty straightforward app where, just talking about the Sweden instance, it's a small cooperative network, and the businesses involved in the network obviously have things for sale, and they upload those to the app. There's a shop basically where businesses can say, these are the items I've got, or the services I've got for sale. Here they are in the shop. Other users can then come along and say, I'm going to put that, I want that, I'm going to put it in my shopping basket. And then the app says, right, okay, if you want, this many books, this is the price of those books. Here you go. Press this button to pay in mutual credit. And then the balances will update, assuming that the transaction goes through successfully. and that's powered by the Credit Commons protocol.
Right. So if yeah, again, I'm thinking of Stroud. So social aspects first. You build a trading network, or you approach networks of trading businesses, and you build the social, you build the trust, you bring them together, and then we can introduce the app. So the tech's ready.
What's also really important is that it's not just the appetite for collaboration, which is really important. You actually have to find the right network structures, because even if there's loads of trust and appetite for collaboration, if there's no actual circularity in the local trading network, everyone's going to get their balances stuck at their limits. This is one of the things the Credit Commons protocol does, is it doesn't just keep track of balances. It says, okay, what are the balance limits which each participant has, within which their balance can fluctuate, and then says, if the user attempts to initiate a transaction which violates those limits, then the transaction can't go through. And so the app also does that. It speaks to the Credit Commons protocol to make sure that's true. And so this is another condition for mutual credit, and why actually we think it's a really hard thing to pull off, is you don't just need high trust and collaboration, you need circularity within the network. Otherwise, people will start using mutual credit and they'll very quickly find I'm stuck at my positive, I'm stuck at my negative limit, I can't do any more trading, and the system stops working.
Right. Okay. So let's talk a bit more about the benefits, and then we'll talk about how this sort of can get going in towns. And so, are there any sort of alternative approaches, similar yet but alternative approaches? And why is the Credit Commons better? And what are those alternatives?
So I'm guessing when you ask about alternatives, you're kind of getting at complementary currencies? Or...
Yes, any kind of alternative approach to try and build a sort of a monetary system for the commons economy.
Okay, yeah, I mean, just to take complementary currencies and kind of run with them, the way most of them work is they collect some fiat money, some British pounds in the UK, and they say, right, we're going to stick those in a bank account, and then for each pound we have in the bank account, we're going to issue £1 worth of local currency. And so there are quite a few limitations of that, but the main one is you're not actually creating any new means of payment in the local economy. All you're doing is you're kind of in a very artificial way, you draw some geographic boundary and say, right, everyone inside this locality, we're going to approach them and ask if they want to accept these local pounds. Everyone outside, you're not included. So there's a very kind of crude, artificial way of drawing an economic boundary, which, locality is not a bad, if you have to pick one single thing and say, right, what do we mean when we say we want money to circulate locally? Geographic locality is probably your single best guess, but it's not good enough. The economy is very, very complex, and so there's a number of problems with that approach. Which make it very, very unlikely to work. But the main thing is that for every pound of local currency you want to issue and that you just hope circulates, you've got to have £1 in the bank, and so you're not actually creating any new spending power. It's
not separate from the current bank system.
It also does nothing to actually decouple you from the current banking system, and there's also no real obvious reason why someone would accept it, apart from just because they like the ideology of it, or they like the novelty of it. There's no real incentive either for businesses to accept it or for consumers to spend it. Nobody really benefits from it, really. At least there's no evidence that it brings any benefits, and most of the experiments, at least in the UK, around local currency have failed.
Yeah. And I obviously the benefits for small businesses and the benefits for communities and the benefits for society as a whole are the same benefits as the commons economy and mutual credit. But also I was thinking that there might be a benefit for the environment, in that it might have a localization tendency. It might help to provide sort of shorter supply chains, because is it right that transaction fees will be slightly higher for each layer representing geographical distance that a transaction has to go through?
So we're talking about the Credit Commons now rather than local currencies.
Oh, yes, we're talking about the Credit Commons.
Okay, yeah, got you. Okay, yeah. So I mean, to come back to the benefits of, say, do you want to talk specifically about mutual credit, or do you want to talk about things like credit clearing, which we see as part of the toolkit for the Credit Commons, or do you want to very specifically focus on mutual credit?
Well, I was no, I was thinking more about the sort of if the credit commons grows to encompass more and more and more of the world, uh, is it right that transaction fees would be cheaper the more
Right.
geographically local the transaction is?
So we are talking about the credit commons generally
Yeah,
now.
yeah,
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I mean, that could be part of it. I don't think that's going to be what's decisive, though. I think the localization is, yeah, well, this is a huge part of why this work is so interesting. I think there will be all sorts of quite powerful feedback loops towards localization once this stuff starts to take off at scale. And exactly as you say, if you have this federated structure where there are local networks of exchange and they have a transaction fee associated with them, and they're part of a larger network, and there's a higher transaction fee for trading at that larger geographical scale, you can see there is some small, but I think probably quite marginal incentive to trade locally. I mean, really,
yeah,
if what you need is on the other side of the country, if it's what you really need, you're probably just going to pay the transaction fee, even if it's 10% more than it would be if it was a local trade. So I do see that as, potentially one parameter you can tweak in order to encourage localization. I really don't think it's going to be decisive. Instead, what I think is going to be the real impact on localization and supply chains, I think in the first instance, it will be effectively a kind of de-risking. And I realized this about 6 months ago. And this only becomes really clear once you start to think of the economy through a network lens perspective. If you think about lots of businesses trading amongst each other locally, you imagine this creates a really, really dense network. So all these businesses are selling each other's stuff to each other, and there's this, really high density flow of goods and services within the local economy, which is, what most people will think of. They think of community wealth building. They think of, thriving high streets and,
yeah,
lively markets and all this kind of thing.
yeah,
That's the vision most people have. If you think about what that implies for businesses invoicing each other, though, a really dense trading network means a really dense invoice network because people buy and sell from each other, invoices get issued. But there's a problem with that because if you have a really, really dense invoice or debt network, what happens is you get all sorts of gridlocks, basically. You get people saying, I can't pay because I haven't been paid. And the denser your network gets, the more local trade you have, the more likely that is to happen. You'll
yeah,
get bottlenecks, traffic jams, queues, all sorts of kind of gridlock. And the result of that is that businesses get paid late. And we know that's a huge problem for small businesses is late payment. I mean, it was even in the Labour Party manifesto. It's a massive problem. And so what we've realized is that if we encourage local trade without being aware of this, actually it's going to make local trading conditions worse eventually. And there'll probably be a kind of backlash effect. People will say, well, I tried trading locally and I never got paid on time. So I'm going back to my old supply chains, which are very linear and are, from far outside the community. What's really nice about credit clearing, for example, is that actually it eliminates those very same gridlocks. The denser the trading network gets, the more debt you can eliminate without the need for money. And so we see there's a kind of really powerful kind of unblocking we can do with things like credit clearing, where we can actually say to businesses with real confidence for the first time, if you do more trade locally and you do credit clearing, you will not only be building your local economy, you will have a better experience. And that I don't think has ever been true before. And I think that is, first of all, that unblocking, the de-risking of local trade, but then also turning that risk into a positive incentive, because the more of your trade locally, the more we can clear for you without money, is going to be, I think, transformative.
So we're back to the idea of credit clearing as the gateway, the first step.
Yes, exactly so. Exactly
And
so.
you're doing that in Liverpool, so that
Yeah.
credit clearing lends itself to big cities rather than small towns. Is that right?
I think in the first instance, yes. I actually don't know what the kind of smallest size of area you could hope to get a viable credit clearing network in is. Obviously, it depends. Some large towns have not very much trade. Some small towns have a huge amount of industry, and so size as ever is nothing more than a proxy. But it makes a lot of sense to try and get it launched in a decent sized city like Liverpool. Absolutely, but we'll find out. There might be some much smaller places than Merseyside, which absolutely have the kind of critical mass of trade in order for credit clearing to make sense. What's also true is that once you've done credit clearing, the next step on our roadmap for local loop is this thing called liquidity injection, which is where you actually make targeted payments within the network. And what's really nice about that is that the credit clearing
You make targeted payments within the next. Where do those payments come from?
Right. So this is the next question: is where does the money come from? The way credit clearing works is you try and eliminate as much debt as possible without making payments. You find the loops in the network, and you just say, right, we can just cancel this out, and that's a really, really great place to start. You don't need to make any payments. It's very low risk. All of that excellent stuff. That's great. The problem is, a bit like mutual credit, it's not going to work for everyone unless you both do a lot of buying and selling locally, and you're in a really, really dense network structure. You're not going to be in any loops, and so we're not going to be able to clear any debt for you with credit clearing.
So if you're a plumber, if you're a local, plumbers tend to be small local businesses, but which is fine. But then where'd you get your plumbing supplies from? There aren't many local plumbing supply manufacturers and retailers. They're big,
Right.
and so that you'll be at a bigger scale suddenly.
Yeah. And so credit clearing, again, that's an argument for doing credit clearing in the first instance in a large city like Liverpool, because it's actually more likely that you'll find enough local enterprise in order for the whole thing to make sense. But even so, credit clearing is nonetheless quite limited. You can't promise everyone's going to benefit from it. It's only going to be the really well-connected businesses with a lot of local trade which do well out of it. And there'll be a lot of people on the network periphery who aren't in any loops and therefore can't benefit from credit clearing. And therefore, very quickly, what you need to be able to do is to actually reach the network periphery. And the way we do that is through this technical term, liquidity injection, which is saying, okay, with credit clearing, we've eliminated the need for payments as far as we possibly can, without using any money. The second question is, okay, looking at the remaining debt network, the stuff which couldn't be eliminated from credit clearing, and given the amount of cash we have available within the network, whether that's the working capital of the businesses or whether you crowdfund some money or the local authority puts up a pool of money, what is the most efficient use we can make of this cash within the network? How can we use our knowledge of the network structure in order to target and prioritize payments, rather than doing it in a totally uncoordinated way? And what that enables you to do is to reach the network periphery in a way that loop credit clearing can't. And it also enables you to operate effectively at a much smaller scale. You really have, for credit clearing, this strong critical density requirement. We expect to have to get together about 100 businesses in Liverpool before we can meaningfully do credit clearing. If you can do liquidity injection, you can work with effectively supply chain fragments. You don't need anything like as much of a critical density. And so, to come back to your question about, how big do you have to be in order for this to make sense? Once we've got liquidity injection going, it seems to me very likely that even quite small cities or medium-sized towns, it will make sense for them to have something like a local loop system.
And is this all part of a package that Mutual Credit Services can provide for a town?
That's the direction we're heading in. Yes.
And do you have any more information that you can point at online about liquidity injection? Because I didn't get that 100% at all. So
yeah, there's almost nothing out there at the moment. We don't even have anything on our website. So at the moment, frankly, no, not very much.
Okay, so that's a future.
That's a to do. That's on the to do list. Yeah. But just to kind of bring it back to the Credit Commons. So okay, so these are two tools which I would certainly bucket in under Credit Commons: credit clearing and liquidity injection. The question, of course, is okay. What's next? For this liquidity injection, the easiest thing to do is just use pounds, fiat, because everyone will accept them at face value. You don't need to do any community building, any trust building. If you say to someone, you'll get paid in pounds and you'll get paid faster, they're just going to say yes, basically. Of course, assuming they're comfortable with, the technology and the privacy and the security and all that kind of things. But nobody's really going to have any quibbles about getting paid faster in pounds.
Who would? Yeah.
The question, who would? The question then is, okay, how can we increasingly substitute the pounds we're using in the network with things like use credit obligations and mutual credit? Where are the bits of the network where we can approach and say, there's an appetite for collaboration, there's enough circularity, there's an anchor institution or an anchor business, which would be a good candidate for issuing endogenous credit, and which can then be introduced into the network in a very small, careful way, but which can increasingly start to displace the need for fiat.
Yeah.
And that's the point at which we, at least in the context of a local loop system, that's the point at which we'd start actually using the Credit Commons protocol, which supports you to use credit obligations and mutual credit.
Yeah, so I will link to more information about credit clearing, mutual credit, um, what else? Use credit
Hmm.
obligations,
Hmm.
and I want to uh, talk more about the connection between those tools and the connection with and the interoperability with
Hmm.
those
Hmm.
things and the Credit Commons protocol, and how do we start to take this forward?
Okay, yeah. So is it the interoperability which you want to start with?
Yeah, whatever makes sense. How do we bring these things together
Okay,
with the
yeah,
Credit
yeah.
Commons protocol and move forward to start to build the Credit Commons?
Right. So I guess I've talked a bit about the sequence of tools which we're hoping to deploy via local loop, and that is credit clearing, liquidity injection with fiat, um, use credit obligations, mutual credit is probably roughly the sequence it's going to go in.
Yeah,
Um,
I can link to all
mhm,
that
mhm.
apart from liquidity injection, but we'll come back to that
Yeah,
later.
yeah.
But
And
yes, go on.
the point about this is that we've built local loop very much to serve SMEs. It's very much a business network, and so it's got this quite kind of commercial flavor. If you look at the way we're communicating it, it's all about late payment, cash flow. People always say, "Is it going to be interoperable with my existing accounting system?" And we say, "Not yet, but it will be." So these very kind of hard-edged commercial questions which we've got to answer.
Yeah,
But that's only one part of the economy. Of course, as you know full well down in Stroud, we're looking at housing commons, energy commons, all these kinds of things. And that's like a completely different opposite end of the spectrum, right? Liverpool is all about building this big network of small businesses, and making use of these financial tools at scale for maximum impact as quickly as possible. Whereas, of course, what you're doing in Stroud, it's much more grassroots, much more community building, much smaller scale in the first instance. You don't need to have a big kind of fancy marketing campaign. It's much more kind of a much more kind of activist feel, and yet nonetheless, of course, you are still planning on using Credit Commons financial tools in order to do the thing you're doing. And so obviously they have to meet in the middle, right? We're trying to
yeah,
change the whole economy. And at some point, it will be amazing to be able to do a local loop in Stroud and bring the housing commons to Liverpool. And I think what is really amazing is that we are working at both these ends of the spectrum.
yeah,
And the question of what's in the middle is a really interesting one.
yeah. A different way of putting the question then.
Mm,
So I understand that at some point Stroud Commons can have a Credit Commons ledger where businesses in Stroud can trade with each other using mutual credit.
mhm.
And which isn't sort of bank money, so it can't be sucked out of Stroud. It can't be extracted from Stroud.
It's
So,
much harder, much harder. Yeah.
but we're also building commons in sectors like housing, energy, land, leisure, etc. Blah blah blah, using
Mhm,
vouchers.
mhm, mhm,
And I
mhm.
understand that these can be on the Credit Commons ledger too.
Yes,
Could you say a bit more about how that would work?
sure. Yeah. So um, the rent credit obligations, which you're doing for the housing commons in Stroud, that's a flavor of a use credit obligation.
Yes.
And because the Credit Commons protocol is a ledger protocol, it's perfectly capable of keeping track of use credit obligations or vouchers, whatever you want to call them. So at least as I understand it, at the moment, for the first house you're doing in the Commons and Stroud, you're just running it through a spreadsheet, right? You're just
Yes.
keeping, right. Okay.
Yes.
So exactly, because it's small scale, because, we're all friends, because it's all quite informal, a spreadsheet is just the easiest tool to use.
Yeah.
Once we start, getting more houses into the Commons, um, and wanting to scale up and kind of formalize things, then the Credit Commons protocol will probably be the thing, the technology through which we track rent credit obligations,
Right.
what's held by investors, what's held by tenants, what's held by et cetera, et cetera. So the Credit Commons protocol will be able to handle that. And exactly as with the mutual credit for the Swedish barter network, you're probably going to want to have some kind of an interface which is usable, a mobile app which tells you, this is how many rent credits you've got in your wallet. This is how long this will
Yeah.
last you. Would you like to make a payment to your Commons housing society to pay this month's rent and rent credits? And you'll press a button, your rent credits will go down, the balance of the Commons housing society will go up.
Yeah.
In exactly the same way. The Credit Commons
Right.
protocol can handle all of that.
Right. So the next step after the spreadsheet, after we've got the housing commons rolling with spreadsheets, the next step is to, I guess, talk to MCS about, let's get all this on the Credit Commons ledger.
Right, exactly. And then another thing which, again, for me feels like one of these really interesting kind of middle parts of the economy between the housing and between the large B2B trading networks is high street
B2B,
vouchers.
business to business trading networks. Okay, yeah.
Right. So local loop up in Liverpool at the moment is all about business to business trading networks.
Yeah.
But of course, there's also B2C, there's also high street retail. And as you know, we've got a whole model around small retailers issuing vouchers, effectively a form of use credit obligation.
And all that can be on the Credit Commons ledger as well?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
so it's getting quite mind blowing. It could okay, so it's quite it's quite comprehensive then.
Yeah.
Right.
If you're trying to keep track of exchange, whether that is exchange using a business-to-business mutual credit, or a peer-to-peer mutual credit, or a rent credit obligation within the housing commons, or a high street voucher, the Credit Commons protocol can keep track of those exchanges and balances.
Right. So it could all interact in as much as eventually, so people in businesses in the network could receive some wages in mutual credit. People could pay for their rent vouchers in mutual credit, etc., etc. And it all could be connected to your network in Sweden, in Vermont, and we could start to build a very sparse global network, which we can start to fill in. Is that?
I mean, yeah, that's the ambition. Is that with the tools we've got, we can address this enormous range of economic conditions in a way which makes sense, which brings immediate benefits, but also drives systemic change we're working towards. And exactly as you say, that it's interoperable. I think the kind of end, or at least at the moment, what seems to us is the kind of the vision for this is that you've got a kind of wallet app on your phone, and let's say for the sake of argument, you're a business, and it enables you to add your invoices, so you can do credit clearing. You're also part of a mutual credit network within that larger clearing network, and so you have a business-to-business mutual credit balance. Obviously, in the rest of your life, you're also a consumer, and so you have a balance showing how many vouchers for the local retail high street you've got, and then also probably you have another balance which tells you about your rent credit obligations, your energy credit obligations, the commons infrastructure. And in principle, what we'd really like is for that just to be, one app with different modules. And, in the example I just gave, that person has all three of them, and there could be other ones as well. But maybe, maybe you don't run a business, maybe you are just an employee, and therefore you have the one which is for your rent credit obligations because, you live in a housing common society, and you have the high street vouchers one because you want to support local shops and use the high street voucher system, but you're not in business, so you don't bother about the B2B mutual credit stuff. But in principle, we'd like to have it all in one place and all interoperable.
It sounds as though it might need a little bit of training to be able to use all this, or is it really intuitive?
Well, I mean, it doesn't exist yet. I mean, we're way before the point where training is on the cards. I mean, it all needs design and building is the first thing to do. Although even before we get to kind of designing and building this all singing, all dancing system, we've got to make these individual instances of much lower ambition and much more limited scope, like the housing commons in Stroud and like local loop in Merseyside. We've got to make them fly first, learn the lessons, learn what works, learn what doesn't work, and then obviously, as we kind of add in different sectors of the economy and different systems, pay really close attention to integrating them really carefully, because when you've already got two pretty technical, complicated systems, which it takes a large amount of work to get to work on their own terms. If you're trying to bring them together, any number of things could go wrong.
Yeah.
And so, as usual, it's kind of small, careful, prove the concept, move on to the next thing. As I said, this is just a vision. So training is, even building this stuff is quite a long way out.
Right. So what I'm hearing is be patient and get the housing commons built.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just the reason I was saying all this was like, I know you're providing an app, but people won't have to get involved with code or anything like that, because code makes me shiver. And I know the app will probably need an API to talk to the protocol, and again, people don't need to know anything about that.
No.
Right. Okay.
I mean, that's a large part of MCS's job, as I said at the start, is to actually, design good software which ordinary people can use and which doesn't make their lives difficult. And if, of course, if they want to know about the technicalities, excellent. We'll happily talk to them about it. But as far as possible, we want to make it look very simple and straightforward and accessible.
Right. So we start. Yeah. Okay. So for right now, we're building all the parts of the jigsaw before we start putting all the jigsaw together.
Yeah. Exactly. If we tried to build, an app which attempted to cover the whole economy and enabled you to do, all of your local shopping and all of your business trade and pay your rent in your rent in rent credit obligations.
There wouldn't be enough components. There wouldn't be enough components to make it work.
Well, we'd just make terrible decisions. It would be massively premature.
Yeah.
We're still trying to demonstrate that even in isolation, something as simple as credit clearing can work in Liverpool. That's where we're at with this stuff. And yes, we've got this huge roadmap of follow-on ideas. Yes, the federation is going to be, up next as soon as we possibly can. But if we start even, designing it in any detail whatsoever, this kind of all singing, all dancing system, it's not going to work. So
So
one step at a time. One step at a time.
What I'm hearing from you is calm down and let's get the components of the Commons economy built, and then we'll start fitting it all together with the credit commons.
And the thing is, it's obviously taken us many years to get to the point where we are now, but the first time is always the hardest. We've learned a huge amount, and as we can continue to build more, the constraints around what's possible and what makes sense will start to become clearer and clearer. And therefore, past a certain point, it'll just be obvious what the next thing to do is. And we won't be talking in speculative or abstract terms. It'll be, well, this is what we've done. This is what works. This is the energy it's unlocked. This is, the obvious next step. Okay, let's do that then, rather than getting too far ahead of ourselves. And so, I think it will. And obviously having a track record, having the credibility of we actually built something and it actually worked, that will, I think, unlock a huge amount of energy.
Yeah.
Which will make things easier.
Yeah, and I guess we can, everybody, we can all produce models and step-by-step guides so that as we go along, so that from our experiences, so that Commons groups can do this in any town.
Yeah. And that's part of the whole federation model, is that when you're doing instead of kind of scaling up in the traditional sense of just saying, right, we've made it work on a small scale. Now we're just going to grow this one instance bigger and bigger and bigger until it covers the entire world. The point is that instead of doing that, we say, okay, what have we learned in this particular situation, which could apply elsewhere? Yeah. How can we replicate it, in the next city along? Of course, knowing full well that it's not going to be a cookie cutter model. We are absolutely going to have to adapt it for the local situation, but nonetheless, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We understand the principles involved. We have already built a lot of the infrastructure. Reproducing it is far cheaper than building it the first time around. So let's reproduce it and then network it together through this federated approach. And then actually, I think that is also entirely consistent with the Damon Centola theory of behavior change, which is that, these kinds of things.
I'll link to that as well, because that's fascinating. I'll link to that.
And very, very, very relevant, because what he says in a nutshell is that this stuff is not going to go viral. It's not like we're going to see local loop instances and housing commons just start to spring up by magic in all sorts of, all around the world just because we happen to know someone there. It's going to spread spatially. So, we're focusing on, once we've got local loop in Merseyside up and running, the next obvious place will be to do Manchester to the east and Lancashire to the north. And we kind of expect it will spread out from there. And of course, because they're
in the southwest.
Yeah, I mean, if we can find the right people there to build it with, but the obvious thing to do is next to Merseyside, right? Because
I'm still thinking Stroud. The biggest conurbation near us is Bristol and Bath.
Sure.
And if we can get a credit clearing system, local loop working there, maybe it could, bleed into Gloucestershire, and we could end up with a little mutual credit system at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, and I think that's probably enough. I mean, there's loads more to talk about, obviously, but there's, it's going to be ongoing. Just finally, tell me about the Credit Commons Society. What's it
right?
What does it do?
At the moment, so at least as I understand, at the moment, the Credit Commons Society is focusing on helping to get ready for the Festival of Commoning in September in Stroud. I think that's the focus of activity at the moment.
Yeah.
But the Credit Commons Society, the intention there is, okay, so MCS is building most of these tools, right? You know, we're building the proof
Mutual
of
Credit
concept.
Services is the tool designer and builder. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, at the moment, we're the only people who understand this stuff well enough, not just to build it, but also to actually, you know, make sure that it's governed right. At the moment, that's true. You know, nobody else really understands this stuff well enough to be really confident that, and this is particularly true for local Merseyside, where it's, you know, a large network of businesses where it's a very, very commercial flavour. Although what we want to happen in the long run is that businesses in Merseyside realise that they own local loop because we're setting up as a member-owned mutual, and they realise that they actually have a say in the way it's run. We don't expect that to happen anytime soon. We expect to be running it in quite a technocratic way for the foreseeable future, because we're the only people who can actually make, you know, safe decisions about the way to run the network. So we think there's going to be a kind of capacity building process where businesses start to realize, oh, there's this thing I'm a part of, which is changing the way the local economy works. And actually, if you look at the members agreement, it says that we have voting rights and an influence over how it works. And at that point, you know, you can start to meaningfully talk about commons governance in the Eleanor Ostrom sense. And the direction we want to be heading in is that increasingly MCS is not, you know, running these networks, because we are the service providers, you know, in the terms with the steward, you might say, you know, with the stewards in the terms you're talking about down in Stroud, and you need a whole separate class of people who are actually doing the governance of the thing. You don't want the people running the network to be the same people having the governance oversight. As I say, by default at the moment, it's just us. But what we want to be working towards is some body of knowledge, some group of people who care enough to pay attention to actually step up and be largely responsible for the governance of even large commercial networks like Local Loop. And I see it as part of the Credit Commons Society's role to start to kind of develop that thinking, develop those ideas, build the capacity to have meaningful commons governance, even over these networks like Local Loop, which are really quite commercial in flavour, and which the members don't see themselves explicitly as being commoners.
Right. Okay. Tom, I'm gonna write this up. I'm gonna turn it into a topic on low impact. I'm going to put it on YouTube. I'm gonna blog it, and I think that was really, really fascinating. I'm going to show it to everybody in the Stroud Commons as well, and see if they can get their head around it.
Okay.
Are you happy to answer queries in the comments?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you
I mean, I
very
hope
much.
it made a few things clearer.
It has.
Probably a few things I could make clearer still in the comments. So yeah, really happy to do that.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right, Tom, I'll speak to you soon.
Yep. Cheers, Dave. Speak soon.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
If you like our channel, please consider liking this video and subscribing. The more people like our videos and subscribe to our channel, the more the YouTube algorithm will share them. It doesn't cost anything, so please press the like and subscribe buttons. And if you click the bell icon just underneath as well, you'll get a notification when we upload a new video. Thank you.